Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first lecture of the Semiospheres Seminar, which is part of a master's program in language semiotics and advertising. The seminar will include a series of lectures in the coming 2 months, so we start now and we'll end up at mid-January at some point. And we are going to discuss different aspects of contemporary and classic mythology, visual culture, and actually also illustration and film. We are starting with Marten Krijgsman, which I horribly mispronounced.
That was good. That was very good.
Who is a researcher at the University of Oxford studying theology. And today he's going to present very, very interesting lecture on myth and ideology and minimal counterintuitiveness and the political foundations of religion. He fought very hard to keep the minimal counterintuitiveness as part of the title, even though I said that that might sound a bit complicated. So now I'm highly interested in what is it about it that is so crucial. I suggest we basically stick to the following format. We will have first Martin's lecture. I ask all of you, and I will also mute myself while he's talking. And once the lecture is over, basically we will have a quick question and answer session. And that's it. We are now recording the lecture as well for everyone who has not been able to see it. And then we will discuss with Martin how to make it available to whoever is interested. And that is it. I mute myself now and give the floor to Martin. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia. Really appreciate being invited. It's really exciting to be able to share this with you all. So today's talk will be on myth and ideology, which I completely will accept is an extremely broad topic, which is why I want to narrow it down slightly to talk specifically about minimal counterintuitiveness, and then sort of take that principle, which I will explain in detail, and sort of bring that into the question of how do we get from minimal counterintuitiveness to religion. And I'll go briefly through 2 examples of ancient texts that reflect the subject matter that I'm interested in best, I think. So we'll get to those when we do. So okay, I hope this is all going to work. And hold on, I'm just admitting some more people. Excellent. Okay, so let's do a little bit of introductory matter, just to sort of clear this, so we're all sort of on the same page. There's a really persistent and deeply problematic question, and that is, how the hell do we define myth? Obviously, there are many different ways in which you could approach that question. Generally speaking, when you say, what is a myth, people tend to think about, various supernatural entities, deities, and Greek myth obviously is the sort of paradigmatic example. Zeus transforming into a swan and impregnating yet some other hapless virgin. That certainly is one aspect of myth, though those very sort of straightforward definitions tend to land us in some kind of in lots of trouble, actually, when we try to start applying them. So, for example, the very famous examples, I think these are probably the big 4: Eliade, Fraser, Campbell, Lévi-Strauss. Eliade kind of actually comes out and actually defines myth and says, it is something that has something to do with origins. So for Eliade, all myth in some way or other is always kind of going back to the origins of something, though it's not always quite clear what those origins are. And so sometimes when Eliade analyzes texts, he has to really sort of force the matter to be about origins in some way, and over time he does of course mellow his stance a little bit, and he sort of moves into, well, maybe it's about origins in a psychological sense, right? Talking about these sort of mythical times, we're really trying to reconnect with our past selves that have been affected by modern society. As the sorry, I'm just admitting people at the same time. People trying to connect with these with their origins as they had lost it in Athens in whatever 600 BC, or Sumer in 4000 BC. Now we can come up with many reasons why this might not be the best definition, but we find similar issues with Fraser, Campbell, and Lévi-Strauss. Fraser never really defines myth. It's very odd. He just kind of takes it for granted that it is something that exists, and doesn't really want to talk about how you define it. And Campbell similarly, of course, Campbell does the even worse thing, which is he has a very sort of dogmatic definition, where for Campbell, myth is always the same story, and if it isn't really the same story, he can find a way to make it the same story. And so, and with Lévi-Strauss, you have a similar but sort of coated in slightly different language issue, where he comes up with this idea, and he then just sort of makes myth conform to that, whether the text really allows for that interpretation or not. So for Lévi-Strauss, for example, myths fundamentally are about oppositions, because for Lévi-Strauss everything is about oppositions. It's all the structuralist, the really hardcore structuralist approach. That means that when you read a myth for Lévi-Strauss, it has to be kind of like how Eliada's definition is always about origins. Lévi-Strauss's always has to be about oppositions. Oedipus, he famously analyzes as something that is about the opposition between valuing blood relations, where he kills his father, which is an undervaluing of blood relations, and he kills himself over shagging his mum, which might be an overvaluing. It's kind of unclear, and Freud surely would have had other things to say about this. But again, we kind of come up with this issue where we kind of find it easy to come up with examples of myths, but it's very difficult to really define what they are as such, right? And so we think about these famous stories about these concepts, the deities, the spirits. Cosmogony is a big one. Where does the universe come from? These big questions that are myth. And for some people, things like fairy tales aren't myth at all, and it's not entirely clear precisely why they aren't myth. One of my favorite examples is that there are some stories that you would definitely want to call myth that don't involve deities at all. So, for example, the story of Theseus, right? He goes off and he slays the Minotaur, and maybe in one ending, right, Bacchus, Dionysus, kidnaps Ariadne. But on the whole, the gods don't really. I mean, there's a fantastic being in the Minotaur, but on the whole, it's a pretty straightforward story of political strife, of ancient obligations, and of ending those obligations by finally defeating the monster. But the gods don't really feature in it at all. And then you have a text like the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible, which is narrated by a deity, but obviously it's not myth. I mean, it's not myth in the same way as any of these others. It's a catalog of laws that just happens to be narrated by a deity. But it's so in that sense, it fits that definition of a myth in that sort of classical Greek sense. But at the same time, it completely fails to conform to our sort of intuitive idea of what makes a myth a myth. And so here, with intuition, I wanna make this totally unforced bridge to minimal counterintuitiveness theory, MCI theory for short. And I think I'm gonna stick with MCI because writing it down isn't annoying enough, but saying it every time, yeah. So so MCI theory is a theory of myth / religion. Depends on how broadly you want to set up your parameters, that was first defined by Pascal Boyer, who I think is French. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. And his, sorry, that should have been the next. There we go. Pascal Boyer, in his 1994 paper, where he demonstrates the existence of a particular cognitive bias, about which I will explain more in a second. But first, let me just explain what minimal counterintuitiveness precisely is, because it's very important that the MCI effect is a very specific cognitive bias. It doesn't, not everything that we would want to call sort of, generally speaking, counterintuitive is minimally counterintuitive, or MCI in the cognitive bias sense. And so what Boyer means by minimally counterintuitive is specifically a violation of a domain level expectation of your cognition. So that's a lot to unpack, but a couple of examples just to give you a general idea. So talking trees, right? Trees are not supposed to talk, but talking trees. Ghosts moving through walls. Ghosts you can analyze as sort of people, but they don't adhere to physics because they can move through walls and doors and whatever. Or flying carpets, right? Carpets are supposed to just obey gravity and go down, but these don't. And what these are specifically, there are particular expectations that our cognition comes up with or uses as a heuristics device in order to be able to analyze the world around us. So it basically, what that means is, in order to prevent you from having to analyze consciously in great detail what's happening around you, your brain is doing all kinds of calculations that you're not even aware of. This is simply your subconscious acting on your behalf. And one of the things that you unconsciously do, or subconsciously do, is you categorize everything. And so according to Boyer, I have my presentation stopped working. There we go. Okay, so this is the okay, let me go through this first. Okay, so this is from one of Boyer's papers, 2003, so slightly more recent than his original one. But here's effectively the scheme of how these things work. So when your brain categorizes everything, it categorizes everything by assigning particular expectations to it, right? And in that sense, according to Boyer, your brain divides everything in a restricted number of templates. Now, these templates are essentially a combination of cognitive expectations. So a dog is a living being, and with living being comes certain other expectations. So it needs to, it needs to eat to survive. It needs, it needs to drink. It procreate. Like a new dog comes into being through procreation, not through, like, you can't build a new dog. Well, maybe with genetic technology, whatever, we can. But generally speaking, according to our, Stone Age brain, animals conform to these expectations. And when one of these expectations is violated, we are statistically much more likely to remember them. You'll see this in a sec. So, but to go back to these templates for a quick sec again, just to make very clear. So a person, something that we want to analyze as a person that violates our intuitive sense of a person's adherence to physics, you can describe as a ghost, right? So this is a very broad, but very helpful way of being able to quantify, to sort of put into specific categorical words how something is counterintuitive. So how something is supernatural. I'm going to use counterintuitive and supernatural to some extent interchangeably. And so this is true for people and for animals. So for example, really the difference between animals and persons is that persons have theory of mind and animals don't. Like you can you assume that another person can think. You don't look at these adorable cats that are right next to me here and think, they have a lot going on inside their skulls. They're really contemplating Foucault. They probably aren't. They care about whether they're warm, right? So these kind of expectations. I don't expect to be able to have a conversation with my cat. I expect to be able to have a conversation with another person. The reason I do this automatically is because my brain subconsciously categorizes people as people. Now, this is really important because, again, we can do this to everything in our surroundings. So an artifact, a man-made object that violates one of your expectations could be, like the blood-weeping statue of Mary at Lourdes, right? Where statues don't have eyes. That's not something that they do. But because we assign an expectation violating quality to it, suddenly the thing becomes supernatural, right? So right, the Boyer's examples are fairly straightforward. You can come up with other ones. And you can look at stories, at myths, at classical Greek myths. You can look at biblical stories, and you can go through them and see, oh, here is something that whatever the deity does, Genesis 1, God puts, creates two humans out of the dust. That's not something that happens. So there is a counterintuitive element in the story. Now, why is this important? Because, and here is sort of the money shot for the statistics. So this is the result of Boyer and Ramble's experiments with minimal counterintuitiveness, where they show that if the white bar is a completely intuitive entity or element in a story, and the dark bar is a counterintuitive one. So one where it's the same element, but that element in some way or other violates one of our domain level expectations. And this is the items recalled list, where they, to my mind, quite clearly show that if something violates your expectations in this specific way, if something is minimally counterintuitive, you are much more likely to remember it. And possibility is here, what we see here, that maybe this effect is stronger with persons than it is with artifacts. Obviously, there are many methodological questions here that I don't want to go into, because that would be a completely different lecture and another whatever year of research. But yes, obviously, if you want to read more on this, I have a bibliography that I'm happy to send through. But for the time being, let's assume let's assume that Boyer is correct and that this effect is significant and in fact exists. And let's talk about sort of the practical application, or the practical implications and applications of this effect, because this is brilliant stuff. This is really interesting because for the first time, basically, we have an analytical system within mythology that allows us to quantify the extent to which something is supernatural, right? We can go through texts and categorize the extent to which the story violates what should be our natural expectations. Now, this is really important because we have to talk about groups. So, like, what is the function of text, of stories? I use text and stories interchangeably here. To groups, and I mean, there's been so much research on this. But what is very clear, and what is, I think, very important to keep in mind here, is how important language itself as a phenomenon, and so the specific form in which we cast our language, but also the stories that we tell in that language, or indeed in others, and how they provide social markers. So Roberts, I think, is a very good example. who's done a lot of research on effectively how these things work, and the fact that stories are so significant for essentially defining what makes a group a group. They're not the only thing that defines groups, but they are a very important contributing factor. This, I think, is where MCI theory really comes into its own, because what MCI theory suggests is the following. That effectively, if stories that contain MCI concepts are statistically more likely to survive, then that means that they are statistically more likely to become an important part of the group identity defining corpus of a group. So a story that contains MCI elements is not only more likely to survive, I mean, that's important in itself, but because it is such a specific thing, right? Because MCI elements happen. It's not entirely clear why people would start telling them in the first place, but they happen. People come up with these stories. I mean, we see in the very earliest recorded stories, and we'll get into this shortly, that there was already quite a sophisticated notion of what supernatural entities really entail. And we see this, of course, in hunter-gatherer groups whose stories have been analyzed in the Amazon, for example. The kinds of counterintuitive ideas that they have, you can categorize them, but there are very different ideas, though they all make them counterintuitive in similar ways, right? It's the rocks or the sacred tree or the ancestral spirits. These are the kinds of features that keep coming back because presumably they are so easy to access cognitively speaking. Now, as soon as they arise, they're more likely to survive. And so as they survive, they become part of this cultural vocabulary of groups. And so there has been research done into this, particularly in, I think there's 2 papers that have analyzed this in Roman and Greek texts, where the kinds of stories indeed that survive sort of as an uncurated group are the ones that tend to have MCI elements. So the sort of the predictions I want to set from kind of going on from this is that MCI stories support group cohesion because they are the kinds of stories that when you tell them and someone else shares the same minimally counterintuitive ideas, there's a connection there. If I having been raised a Christian in Western Europe, went to China where I didn't speak the language and I didn't know anyone, but I went to a church, I would immediately have a stronger connection with those people in that church because the kinds of counterintuitive vocabulary that we share because of the religion that we both intuit, we automatically have a stronger connection there. Does that make sense? Broadly? Hopefully. Okay. I'm going to give you 2 examples and hopefully that will make it even clearer. So, okay, so one, MCI stories support group cohesion because of the specific form that they're in, because of the specific shared ideas that you need to have before you can really properly engage with them. And then the second aspect of that is that well, maybe that means that these kinds of stories contain group markers. That actually maybe these stories start serving very specifically as it's not just that by telling the stories themselves that you're supporting group cohesion, right? It's not just by referring to hippogriffs, right? If I talk about hippogriffs, people who've read Harry Potter are like, I know what he's on about. right? And there's that automatically means that there is a connection there. If you have no idea what hippogriffs are, you're out of the loop, you're out of the picture, right? You have no idea, you can't engage with the conversation at all, right? So there's the implicit connection, or the implicit group cohesion marker, but then there's the specific ones. So the ones where the story itself gives you explicit ideas of what it means to belong to this group. So this can be, well, I'm just going to give you the examples because they will probably do a better job than a hypothetical example. Okay, so let's talk about Enuma Elish. This is literally the greatest text that was ever written. It's only slightly hyperbolic. So Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation myth or national epic. It contains creation aspects on which Genesis 1 in the Bible was very likely based. And Enuma Elish is a fantastic example because, one, we know that it was written down by some guy at one point. Two, it contains literally all of these points. It contains minimally counterintuitive examples. It contains absolutely minimally counterintuitive, but what we could call maximally counterintuitive examples, where characters are very, very complex supernatural entities. And more importantly, it is a political masterpiece. So let's go through a couple of examples from this text. Now, I want to make it clear, this is not just me cherry picking. Enuma Elish is not a unique text in that sense. These kinds of texts you find all across the ancient Near East. These like foundation myths of cities, of nations, that involve deities at real life locations. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of verses within this text that hopefully illustrate quite well what I mean with this whole MCI business. Okay, so we start with the birth of Marduk. Now, this is a really interesting one because Marduk is the chief god of Babylon, and at the start of this text, he doesn't exist. So the text starts with the world uncreated the world a mess, basically, and two deities existing. They're both water deities, and they mingle their waters together, and from that you get the next generation of gods. Marduk is really only the third or the fourth generation of deities, and he gets a proper introduction, right? He is. So he's born right in the center of the sanctuaries, in the Chamber of Destinies, which is the heart of the Babylonian temple. The Room of the Archetypes is another name for it. And he is the wisest of the wise, the sage of the gods, his title, obviously. And Bel means Lord. So he's born, and they're already calling him Lord. So obviously they're very strongly signaling this is the big one. And then they sort of complete that little introduction with a doublet where this is a very common strategy in Akkadian texts, where they say the same thing again with slight difference. So in Apsu, which is the underwater sea where his father's palace is, was Marduk born. In pure Apsu, Marduk was born. So we basically start the text with sort of very kind of boring, like gods are born, whatever, and then bam, Marduk. Here is Marduk, and Marduk is a weird one. His description, which I haven't included here, is very strange. He has 4 arms and four ears and 4 eyes. It's all quite. If you wanted to draw him, it would end up very strange, and this is their supreme deity, right? But Marduk is the city god of Babylon. So we're starting off this story with this brief introduction, and then it's the introduction sets us up with, okay, here is the hero. But the hero is not without his struggles. Now, of course, just to sort of drive home the point of minimal counterintuitiveness, here is a God whom we must know. This introduction doesn't work if we don't already understand who Marduk is, right? If we're like, oh, Marduk was born, well, who's Marduk? It wouldn't work if we didn't already have that piece of information, right? Marduk then goes through his rite of passage, which is slaying his grandma, Tiamtu, the sea goddess, who had conspired with some other of her demon spawn to kill the gods because they were making too much noise and they couldn't sleep. This is a legit trope in ancient literature, and Enuma Elish certainly uses it. It's also the reason in one of the flood myths why the gods set up the flood to kill everyone, because the gods can't sleep, the humans make too much noise, so let's kill them all. In this case, it's a goddess who wants to kill the other gods because they're making too much noise. And with the defeat of Tiamtu, who is depicted as some kind of water dragon, she has a tail, like he hangs her up like a fish after he's killed her. But after he's killed this this personified embodiment of evil, essentially, he takes her corpse and makes the world out of it. Now, obviously, this is certainly not up to scratch according to our scientific understanding of the world, but the important thing is this is a very highly specific, and I mean, again, you can do this for any creation text that you might come across. The way in which the world is created is a very specific counterintuitive concept. The world is made out of the corpse of a dragon. The world is, it's made out of rock and sand and water and stuff, right? So having that sort of that transfer of expectations of what is you're actually standing on, that is a very specific counterintuitive idea that you have to intuit before you can really work with this. And why I keep hammering on this, I will make very obvious in a second. Now, let's also hit our political note, because in tablet 5, almost towards the end of that particular tablet, he doesn't just create the world. Marduk founds Babylon. So this is really on the nose, right? Here is the king of the gods who has showed that he is the best through defeating the incarnation of evil. He is defeats everyone else. Everyone has subjected themselves, all the gods have subjected themselves to his rule. And he's like, what I'm going to do as my first act? I'm going to create Babylon. Now, obviously, from a Babylonian perspective, this is super on the nose, because the Babylonians are just writing down a story where their city is the first city that is created. And of course, in some sense, that makes sense. But I think, we really have to appreciate just how blunt the author was in assigning Babylon the primacy of the universe. Basically, this is the first city. This is this is where the homes of the great gods are. Right. So this text doesn't just say our God, the God whom we worship is the God who actually made the world. They're saying the God whom we worship is actually our city God. Like our God is the guy who made all this stuff, and he's the one who we worship as the king of the gods, and he clearly deserves it because we're the rulers of this giant empire. So it's kind of unsubtle in its approach, and this is where I think this is where this text is really interesting, because it doesn't just end with that. It's not just a text that's kind of that people have in their library and never read. This is a text that was recited every single year at the New Year's festival, and contains at the very end a clause where the scribe has written that whoever hears it has to pass it on to the next person. The father who hears this must tell his son. And so, it's even less subtle than just this is a political text where we have all these very blatant statements. This text itself indicates we need you to use this text as a means to propagate Babylonian identity, right? Okay, let's really quickly look at a response to this, which you may have read. It's called Genesis. It's in the Bible. So Genesis 1 to 2:4a is the very specific designation of the first creation story, where God, who is called Elohim rather than Yahweh, I'm just gonna, this is a long story, but Elohim is Yahweh, so this is the God that we know. He creates the world in the sort of the famous, there's the morning of the first day, and then he does a thing and he says it's good, and then it's morning, it's evening, it's the end of the day, right? And what we find here is a very interesting response to the Babylonian text, which is why I bring it up. So in this text, we start out with the very same situation. The world is kind of a mess. But what's interesting here is that the Hebrew word for sort of the mess that the world is tehom, which is etymologically very close to the name of the incarnation of evil in Enuma Elish, Tiamtu. So what we have here, according to biblical scholars, is what you could call a sort of a depersonalized entity, right? Tiamtu is still there. She's still sort of in the background. And when we read Tehom, we understand, well, it's the deep. It's not the same character, but you have to have that in the back of your mind, right? That, well, hold on, but this is the start of the universe. Here is, this very specific word is being used, but it doesn't have any of that that conflict story. So it's very different in that sense, right? Where stuff just happens. God just says, "Let there be a dome." Oh, sorry, I was looking totally at the wrong slide there. Yeah, so right, so the Tehom verse comes right at the start, and then moving on very quickly, there is the messing up of the water, right? He does all kinds of things. He divides the water into two halves and puts up the dome to make the sky. There's all kinds of, and the process here is very similar to what it is in Enuma Elish, except there's no resistance. There aren't any other gods. So this really drives home the point that the minimally counterintuitive idea of this deity is very different. So in order to really engage with the story, you have to forget everything you know about, the fight between the gods, about all these fantastical stories that the Babylonians tell you, right? Here is the other story where you need to get adjusted to these counterintuitive concepts, and therefore, the sooner you can work with them, the better you can engage with the story and the people who tell the story and hold the story as normative. So we have a complete sort of rewrite here of this other story, and you see this very clearly in the Hebrew text, where the sun and the moon are created, because for whatever weird reason, this has always been a problem until now, the text doesn't talk about sun and moon, so it doesn't use the words sun or moon. It calls them the great light and the lesser light. And I mean, it's clear what they mean, but they don't use the specific word, presumably because in Hebrew, which doesn't record, the Hebrew alphabet doesn't have vowels, the ancient Hebrew alphabet at least, and the word for sun, which is shemesh in Hebrew, has exactly the same vowels as the Babylonian sun god Shamash. So it's a very small difference, but presumably in order to not give you the wrong impression that actually here Shamash is appearing in this text, no, he makes the great light. There's no room for error there. This is a rewrite. He's being edited out of the story. and they're being very careful in doing so. Right. So I think that's the whistle stop tour of two examples of ancient Near Eastern myths that employ minimally counterintuitive ideas, specifically, I think for group binding or group marking purposes. And yeah, the final thing, just to sort of to drive home the point of where was the political in this, is that these are stories that are being written. People are aware that they are writing these stories, right? Often we think of myths as stories that just kind of happen, right? They just are, whatever, you know, ancestors way back wrote them or recorded them. It was oral tradition, right? With these two stories, we have a specific point of composition. We know that people sat down and wrote these stories and messed with them. You know, they changed these stories around as they circulated within their respective cultural groups. So these texts are being written and told and retold with very specific purposes in mind. And so there, I think we have sort of the foundations of religion as a political entity, where sharing these stories itself is a political act. So I'm going to open to questions now. I'm sure there will be many, so but I'm no Zoom expert, so I hope that, hold on, let me just see if I can get everyone. I think there might be a raise hand kind of thing where we can, or actually, Julia, if you want to moderate, does that work?
Yeah, even though I think you're the person who can give the floor to other people, because I have no.
I mean, I think, well, so can't anyone just unmute themselves and talk?
Yeah, I think that would be the easiest. So if someone wants to talk, they should just unmute themselves and ask. Maybe I will start with something, as I'm already unmuted.
Yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to ask you, so what you're saying is extremely interesting first, and I actually didn't know this theory of myth. So I know Roland Barthes, etc., but the minimal counterintuitiveness one is completely new to me. And I just wanted to ask you, if I understood you correctly, so you started by explaining minimal counterintuitiveness by cognitive abilities of our brains, basically. Mm-hmm. So things that are, well, almost biological there.
Right.
But then when you were giving the example of the Babylon myth and the Bible, what the Bible did was to rewrite something that was intuitive, but intuitive as far as I understood, and maybe I'm wrong, so this is my question. It was intuitive for people from this region because they already knew the Babylonian story. So this was intuitive because people had heard of it, and not so much because it was intuitive biologically speaking, that biologically we think that there are many gods, right? So my question is counterintuitiveness necessarily counter our just physical, biological intuitions, or is it also counter the intuitions we have from our culture? And as a follow-up, so this is my first question, and then
yes.
If it is the latter, can you use your theory to, I don't know, explain contemporary myths? So do you think that contemporary myths, like the ones Roland Barthes talks about, can be explained with this or no? So these are my questions.
Yes, I have to admit, I'm not tremendously familiar with Barthes' approach to modern myth, but yes, actually that's a really good point that I thought I was just going to mention because I'd forgotten to put it in the presentation and it completely omitted. Basically this year, another evolutionary anthropologist wrote the paper I was going to write. I'm sure you're all familiar with this phenomenon. Yes, where essentially he makes the point that what makes something counterintuitive is contextual, and so I think it's still important to distinguish between things that are naturally intuitive and things that are sort of acquired intuitive, right? So I think actually with Sahar, I had this example where we're talking about religion, and to me, someone who used to be a Christian, was raised in a Calvinist context, right? The idea, I think, like philosophically, logically speaking, the Trinity is a completely ludicrous concept, but it's totally intuitive for me. Like I can talk to other Christians about the Trinity as if I totally, you know, accept that it's a thing. I think it's a ludicrous concept, again, logically speaking, but because it's something that I was raised with, it's something that I can intuitively engage with. And this is, I think, the really important sort of modification of Boyer's original position, where sort of the I don't know, almost like the hermeneutics of myth, like the way in which we establish knowing, I think is very strongly mediated by what we learn. So I think you're absolutely right. Modern myths, and I would honestly, I have to mention this. Do you guys remember I fucking love science on Facebook? It was this really big thing for a while, where it was this like curated page that was just kind of highlights of science. Taking a bunch of shortcuts, and it wasn't quite science, but it sounded really cool because we fucking love science, right? And I think that comes very close to counterintuitive narration of scientific principles, because when you hear about what's the exoplanet hunting telescope, it finds a planet where it rains diamonds. That's a counterintuitive concept, right? It's spot on, right? It's precipitation. It's a natural phenomenon, except it's out of another natural object. So it's a perfect example of like, I am convinced that our brains are not wired sort of properly to really engage with the level of detail that the scientific method has given us access to. So like atoms and stuff, I think that's way beyond our evolved cognition. So the stories I think that we tell to make these things comprehensible very much behave like myths, I think. And maybe what we see here is, or what that means is that maybe we can use that to understand why, say, Western conceptions of scientific understanding of the world run so counter to other Western or non-Western ways of understanding the world. If we think, well, science is just a neutral, natural thing, when it really isn't, because we're still employing this minimal counterintuitiveness effect to some extent, or at least we are mythologizing our stories in a sense, to make this information accessible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually working on mythology when it comes to digital technology, and so the way we perceive how algorithms operate is, I think, also very similar to what you describe about science. So when we talk about Facebook or Twitter, etc., we always explain them in some super complicated ways. But anyway, thank you very much. That absolutely answered my question. I shut up.
Great. Anyone else? Nathan, you look like you have a question. Unmute yourself first.
There, now is my mic on? Okay. I don't know if I have a question, but yeah, it was an interesting talk for sure. I think you brought in a lot of different elements there. You brought in the evolutionary psychology aspect. And yeah, I think the question is where to go from here. You talk about context being important, but what's kind of the next step? How can we make this stuff even deeper and go even further?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thanks. Honestly, this one I've been struggling with myself. I think what would definitely be helpful is just more evidence that the MCI effect actually works. I mean, clearly there's something going on. I mean, there has to be something that is rooted in the evolved structure of the brain to account for the prevalence of supernatural concepts in societies that have never been in touch with each other at all, right? I mean, I don't mean that in a sense of it's the sort of what's it called, the completely brain farting right now. I'm even blanking on the name. My God, the collective unconscious. My God, sorry, that had to come from deep. Like, okay, so I don't mean it in that sense. I don't mean that like we all share the this sort of common sense of the supernatural. I don't think that's true at all. I think that, as with other things, it's much more convincing to understand the human brain as something that has the capacity for certain phenomena. I mean, phenomena like music, for example, and language, that probably, you know, aren't really their own separate thing, but they arise from, you know, parts of the brain that just function in a way that allow for these ideas. So I think that's where we have to go. We have to, I mean, this is just a general problem, obviously, but we just have to understand better how the hell the brain works. And I think for my research, I would be very interested to go into a more like applied direction to see, you know, kind of to look at those points where we see that interface between counterintuitiveness and sort of an ideology, that like normative culture where you're like, you know, here is some dogma that you have to accept. To what extent can you maintain that dogma when you're not really being raised with those ideas? So I mean, like I mean, in the Netherlands, for example, you have tons of, you know, third and fourth generation immigrants who came from Muslim backgrounds, who don't really believe in the specific like dogmatic aspects of Islam, but do still have that like that God sense, but that like specifically that there is only one God, damn it, sense. So I think those are really interesting sort of marginal cases that can really help us understand better how the phenomenon precisely works, and whether it, you know, but the sort of the clickbait headline paper I want to write is was Luther right? And it's basically, you know, in Roman Catholicism, there's this question, or there's the way that you pray to, or the way that you work with saints is you don't pray to the saint. The saint doesn't have power, dogmatically speaking. So when you pray to like St. Christopher to help you, whatever, get somewhere safe, or like it's not St. Christopher who gets you there safe. St. Christopher then has a chat with God, and then God makes sure that you get there safe. So and like this is a very specific, quite complex chain of authority, and I'm wondering whether, you know, Luther said, well, that's nonsense. Why not just cut out the middleman? Like, God is omnipotent; He can hear your bloody prayer, like whatever. So I'm wondering whether if you got you know dyed in the wool Roman Catholics who aren't really interested in dogma, whether they don't attribute the agency to the saints. That's what I'm wondering. So that's just a very specific example of can we use this concept to tease out just how modern religion works a bit better.
Very quick remark, if you go to southern Italy, it's amazing because they have these shrines for saints on every corner, and I think they definitely seem as if they are attributing agency to saints themselves, or at least that's what it seems to a foreigner. I'm Orthodox, so I'm a completely...
No, I think that's perfectly sensible. I mean, I brought up the example of the Virgin Mary of Lourdes earlier. I mean, like, what's the like? There shouldn't be a point to a healing pilgrimage if all that the saint is going to do is pray to God to heal you. Then then you can just invoke the Virgin Mary anywhere, and you know it's that kind of the logic of how that works. And of course, within all formal religions, there are very sophisticated theological reasons why the things are done this way, and there are always very clear, very very clever justifications for these kinds of behavior. But I'm just interested in the cognitive side of it. Like, can we really engage with religion sort of naturally without being reminded by theologians of, you know, how to do it properly, how to do these complex things? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think just kind of picking up where you left off, I think an interesting additional thing to look at would be looking at how like minimal counterintuitive ideas kind of overlap with social bonding, because it's my and group cohesion talking about before, because it's my supervisor's theory that one of the major reasons humans are religious is because it brings people together and it facilitates group cohesion and these sorts of things. I don't think it's ever been looked at to see whether or not you know, the minimally counterintuitive, like perhaps the more outlandish and kind of crazy some of these ideas are, maybe people are even feel even more closely bonded because of that. I mean, one thing to know that people become bonded over like shared experiences, and like the more emotionally outrageous those shared experiences are, the more bonded they become. So maybe engaging in these kind of outlandish, not too outlandish, but pretty crazy stories, people feel even more bonded. So it might be interesting to look at like different types of stories with different types of minimally counterintuitiveness to see if people feel more bonded in some cases than others.
Right. I mean, I think the shared suffering narrative is a very well attested phenomenon. Like exactly, people who go through bad stuff together bond over or bond more strongly. And I'm wondering whether you could do like you could look at some of the like self-mutilation cults or ecstatics, whatever you want to call them, where, you know, people flagellate themselves, or people like get crucified to show their devotion. I mean, and there's a very long tradition of this where, like, you know, Spartans were supposed to show their devotion to Artemis by being whipped on the altar of Artemis, and if they were whipped to death, they were really tough. I mean, dead, but really tough. So it's for sure there's that sense. What I'm wondering, just going back a little bit in what you were saying, what I'm wondering is to what extent religion is something that allows for these things, or whether it is something that happens to work well, right? It is the reason that religion survives. Which way around is it, right? Do we have the group bonding because religion exists, or is religion something that also works, that happens to survive, that is one of the things that works towards group bonding? Because I'm convinced that there are many other ways in which bond, you know, group bonding works.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So you're asking like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is religion more fundamental or bonding?
Exactly. Well, exactly. And I think it's very important also to note that like minimal counterintuitiveness isn't the only thing that explains like why myths are the way they are. I think that, you know, that's a simplification that you know, doesn't really do justice to the complexity of how these things develop. Right? It's also deliberate political pressure. It's also, you know, whatever other things you can come up with. It doesn't just survive because it's minimally counterintuitive, right? Minimally, like the MCI effect gives it its first edge, but then, you know, if it survives, it can be because it's politically convenient, right? I mean, Christian missionaries traveling around the world forcibly converting entire populations to Christianity, right? I mean, those people definitely didn't start believing in a Trinity because it was, you know, contextually minimally counterintuitive to them. They started believing because they were made to with force. And then maybe after a couple generations, yes, they're engaging with these ideas intuitively, but originally, surely not.
May I ask something very quick? Do we need to believe in myths, or are they just stories we tell? So, because the way you describe it, there is no difference, and this is I think we have argued about this before as well. But the way you describe it, there is no difference between myth and religion. And I somehow think that we can just tell myths as as stories that, I don't know, have a political function, bind us together.
I don't think that's quite right.
Also, I guess with faith. So like Christianity is completely, I don't know what the word in English is, preposterous. Like it's totally crazy, irrational, etc. But if you read, for example, I don't know, many philosophers, they would tell you that this is precisely why we need to believe, and that's what makes it so great, because it's its very rationality that requires this leap of faith. But this is different from just telling us a story. So my question is, do we need to believe in myths or no?
I'm tempted to say almost that that's the wrong kind of question to ask. Not to be disparaging to your question, which is actually a very good question. But I think if we approach myth from the perspective of MCI theory, we're asking the question of sort of what defines them, right? You know, if enough people become convinced by my approach to myth, then eventually we will all agree that, you know, what makes a myth is that it contains MCI concepts. That it's that simple. And I think the question of defining a myth by its constituent components does not mean that it cannot have other purposes. So, you know, a myth can be, I don't know, you know, I mean, I don't know if you have the same experience, but, you know, certainly in our, you know, when I was a kid, you know, everyone in church had like a favorite Bible verse, and that could be really whatever. You know, you know, some people had the sort of the, you know, there's a time for everything from Ecclesiastes. Some people had like the whatever the wise sayings from Job. Other people had, but like you can have, you know, because it's really important to you for whatever reason, you can literally have anything. I think that there's a different layer maybe of the way in which we engage with myth as texts that are important to us. But I think that's a very like reader response kind of question. And I'm approaching this far more from a, you know, a relatively dry maybe, but sort of like a population statistics, you know, how does our brain work under the hood kind of approach. So I definitely don't want to say that, you know, I think we can analyze myths as minimally counterintuitive concepts, and at the same time recognize that that people believe in them in other ways. But I do think that minimal counterintuitiveness is the more convincing reason why they are the way they are and why they survive. Do I need to say anything about religion then? I mean, religion is just everything on top of, like, religion can use myth. Religion is everything else. Religion is faith. Religion is what you do. I mean, the modern world is really weird in that we, like, all the biggest religions are orthodox religions, right? It matters what you believe. Like ancient Near Eastern religions, like no one cares whether you believe that Marduk exists. Like he's just there. You know, what's important is that you sacrifice some sheep to him. You know, if you do that, you're a good believer. So sort of the nature of religion is very different in that time. So, you know, those are other, you know, to further complicate the picture, obviously. Yes. Any other questions? That sounds like a no, unless someone has failed to unmute themselves. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. It's really fun. I love talking about this kind of stuff. So, and yeah, thank you for joining me.
Thank you as well.
Some excellent questions.
Apart from the last one, which was clearly
one of the advantages of doing these things over Zoom is that you can't really applaud, because applause is always so awkward at the end. Nice one. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming. Friends who have come.
And yes, thank you to also everyone else from the master's program and from the Facebook page who has joined us.
Yes, and
we have recorded this. It is the first time I'm recording a Zoom meeting, so let's see what the end result is. But hopefully we'll also have the recording after Martin sees it and approves of it soon.
Oh, I'm sure it's fine. And also just to include in is, I don't know if the recording's still on, but if there are any like further questions or if anyone wants bibliography, I'm more than happy to continue rambling about about these things.
Cool. Thank you very much. And
all right, cheers.
Bye. And I think, Martin, you should kick us out because you're the host now.
Oh yeah. All right, guys.
Have the full power.
I'm not sure how to do this. I'm gonna stop sharing and then end. Bam.